Goeienaand. Good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world. Yep, I have a video attached here which I find very, very interesting. The fellow talking is apparently an intellectual in South Africa, and he's talking about confusion, the confused black population. And after listening to him for 25 minutes, I am totally confused. But it is interesting what he raises. He's got a couple of interesting points that he puts forward. Most of what he says I don't agree with. I think there's some huge holes in his story, but it's just interesting to understand what's going on. What are they thinking? And I think that's often just kind of left out of the picture and needs to be discussed. All right, guys, here comes the video. Please remember to subscribe to be kept informed, and have a great day. Bye for now.
Afternoon to everyone. It's Bukelani Boneswa here once again. Today I just want to, discuss the state, of black people in South Africa. Today I want to discuss the condition in which black people, exist upon in South Africa in this day and age, 25 years deep into democracy. Um, I want to submit to you that black people in South Africa, they are confused. Um, and the source of this confusion comes from, multiple um, issues, multiple social, political, and economic issues, which, directly contribute in that state of, confusion. A state that I describe in my book as chaotic confusion. That state of confusion in itself, it mounts and builds um, a very chaotic, social, existence or social, circumstance uh, that makes it, difficult for black people, you know, um, to exist freely, just like other people, just like white people, just like Indians. And if you go deeper into the reasons as to, what causes, this confusion in black people today, one also discovers the fact that, politically speaking, a lot of things that black people they passionately hoped by now they will have, already came into existence uh, as a result of the promises, that the leading, government or the government of our day, which is black government under the National African National Congress, which is ANC, has promised them to fulfill. Most of the things that they were promised haven't been yet fulfilled. So in itself, that has also, erupted and stimulated some of the effects of this confusion that black people find themselves deeply mired into, today. Also, the fact that this is a very, very important, um, you know, uh, input in this argument, which is the fact that 25 years down the line, black people still exist within the framework of poverty, a systematic poverty that was architecturally designed by the previous system of apartheid that glorified, whiteness through white privilege and other certain racial, exclusive advantages that were solely accessed by white people. And also, eh, in addition to that argument, or as a thread of that argument, black people still exist, you know, under a very rife black economic subjection, which makes it very difficult for black people to create an economic structure that is going to make them to be able to sustain themselves in isolation from, their dependence from other races, in South Africa. Because when you look at the core of the social, you know, um, orientation in our society, fundamentally, the economic orientation, we tend to find that black people are too dependent on other races for them to sustain themselves with means of economic possessions. To simplify this argument, I would say black people, for them to be able to sustain themselves, they have to they have to be they have to sell um, their labor power at a very, very compromising terms. uh, they have to sell their labor power in the dynamics of exploitation between them as employees and their employers. So that very rife, capitalistic system that thrives on the exploitation of black, people, that economic, capitalistic system that thrives at constantly making black people workers and dependent in other races instead of being independent and depend in sustaining themselves economically because of the lack of that economic structure which will make it possible and make it able for them to sustain themselves in isolation from their dependence to other races in South Africa. Also, when you look at the nature of unemployment in South Africa, but this argument is very broad. It does not, solely, to some extent, it does not solely um, mean that it's only black people in South Africa who are unemployed. This is across, the racial, background, and this is also a global phenomenon. The issue of drastic, rise of unemployment, an uncontrollable drastic rise of unemployment in South Africa and elsewhere in the world. But the difference between South Africa and other countries in terms of like the management of this rise of unemployment is that in many countries they tend not to do so bad than us in terms of like the management of this rise of unemployment. It is because um, they know or they are working tirelessly in terms of like monitoring and controlling this rise of unemployment. But when you see here in South Africa, you'll find that there is no there is no structure that is monitoring this rise of unemployment in South Africa. It is like there's a floodgate for it to rise as it should. It's like we say, okay, there is unemployment, therefore there's nothing we can do about it, as much as the rhetoric is the antithesis of the reality, because the government tends to promise that they are putting policies, programs, initiatives in place in order to curb this rise of unemployment. So in other countries, in comparison to South Africa, in other countries, you tend to see that there is a very there's a very strong determination and commitment in terms of like monitoring and controlling such a rise. Whereas here in South Africa, when one is looking very clearly, we tend to notice the fact that it is as if it is not regulated. This increase and this rise of unemployment is not regulated. It is not monitored. Hence, we tend to see a lot of South Africans who possesses skills, who have education. They rather go outside and work in other European countries, or although we tend to see very few example of South Africans who possess the skills and then go into other African countries. But they, in most cases, they tend to go overseas. and render their services and their skills in exchange of salaries or wages, since they don't access, or they don't get the opportunities of accessing the employment market here in South Africa as a result of the scarcity of those opportunities. And even if they are there, but they are not molded into a structure that is recruiting people with such requirements of skills and qualification and credential. Um, so going back um, to what I've mentioned, which is the thematic framework of one of the as one of the sources of black people's confusion, which is the political orientation. So I want also to go back to that argument again, just to extend it further with another dimension, and which is the fact that um, black people in South Africa, um, after the collapse of apartheid, the period of transition from apartheid to democracy, a lot of us black people, um, the process of transition was a process that brought hopefulness in all the sense of the word. It brought hopefulness to an extent that when we, even now, as we realize that black people do possess or do have the political power, we tended to use that as a justification of saying this is the destination of our, of the inquiry of our struggle. So, in other words, we were saying, so we have finally arrived where we have been, journeying towards, which is, the political, or having possessed the political, power. Um, However, I tend to differ, especially with a lot of, scholars, a lot of, intellectuals, fellow, intellectual and fellow writers, when we are discussing about the issue of political power in South Africa. Because my argument is this, contrary to popular belief, my argument is this: black people don't possess any political power. Let me repeat, maybe some of you didn't hear me. I am saying black people do not possess any political power. That may be an argument that is masqueraded under the pretext um, of seeing, black faces. But the argument, as I extend it further, is that any political power that does not appropriate economic power, that political power is useless. Now, it's 25 years down the line. We have been solely, as black people, bragging about the political power that we're having, bragging about the fact that we are now governed by the ANC, which is the black government, under the, the banner or under the auspices of, the political power. But the political power alone is nothing. As much as I understand, this territory of discussion was one which was, brought forth by Nkwame Nkrumah, the late, president of Ghana, a very, resolute and unapologetic Pan-Africanist. So what he said was that African countries, they must first target to obtain, political power, and if they did that, then the economic power will follow. Of which there is nothing in that argument itself, and I don't find it very contradicting to my argument, but I find it to differ in terms of like the historical context and also the present context. So Kwame Nkrumah was, uttering those statement or that argument on a very different context, which is a historical context, that relates to colonialism, right? So during colonialism, black people, throughout the continent, African, countries, they didn't possess an autonomous, an autonomous um, um, control of their own countries. And political power as a very, very necessary tool of self-determination was very necessary at that time to first, possess it, because it will be a contradiction if, uh, not a contradiction in a sense, but it won't yield any impact as compared to gaining political power first, if black people they sorted after, or they sought after possessing economic power first, because you can have economic power, but if it is not backed by political power, then that it's the same argument that economic power is useless. But the key important power here is political power, because political power in itself, it determines the attainment of economic power. So Kwame Nkrumah, he mentioned that in the context of the historical necessity of possessing the political power, and therefore, if we have done that as African countries, then the rest will follow, which is the economic power. But fast forward into 2019, here in South Africa, 25 years later, after having attained uh, freedom as black people, we still tend to find that black people don't have any you know tradition, economic tradition, or economic structure that can sustain themselves. Hence my argument is the fact that one of the most important ways of us attaining that economic independence, attaining that economic structure, or instilling that economic structure, that foundation of economic you know um, masculinity, that economic autonomy in our country, is to make sure that, because we are a majority here in South Africa as black people, if you can redirect our support in terms of like consuming the goods and services, if we can redirect our support for our own people, the businesses that are owned by our own people, and redirect the support that we have been giving to white businesses such as your Adidas, your Shoprite, your Markhams, your Pick and Pay, all these white businesses that are not doing nothing in return to elevate the condition, and the standard of our society. If you can redirect our support that we have been giving to them and channel it towards, supporting the businesses that are owned by the people who look like us, so that in return we can, remind them and say, look, black businesses, we have been supporting you. At least do something in return to elevate the condition of our society, to elevate the condition of our communities. But we can't do that in white businesses, because they don't care about us anyway. The only thing they care about is making sure that we, consume, their products and their goods, in relation to not, doing nothing productive in developing our communities. So there are many ways of creating, that structure. And also, if we can, and and I've been listening to a lot of um, thinkers who are arguing, especially financial, experts who have been arguing how easy it is to create a black bank, um, and how we can find ways, ethical and moral ways, of sustaining, such institutions. Because it's one thing to have something, but it's another to sustain, right? Especially we as black people, I think psychologically we've been corrupted, by our experience, by this deeply entrenched, psychological consequences that are directly imported, from the culture of apartheid, the culture of being excluded, from certain opportunities. And then when we get the opportunity of, accessing those opportunity, we tend to be very selfish, and always like pursue the calling of our personal interest rather than uh, going back to the old tradition of responding to the calling of the collective interest and making sure that we serve the community, we serve our own people. But when we tend, to access those opportunities, we do the opposite to that. And also, we tend not to show healthy relationship with money, right? And we've seen this like in many organizational groups that we start with our fellow black people. Whenever we are entrusted with finances or keeping the finances, there's always issues that arises in terms of like the laundering or the mismanagement of the finances. So we need that moral and ethical capacity for us to sustain those institutions that will undergird, that will sustain such economic structures that we need as the people, as a nation, as a race, as community, as a society. So going back to the theme of this video, which is the fact that the black people in South Africa, they are confused. As they are confused, they tend to try to find ways um, that can help them to overcome such confusion. Although some of the things that they find in overcoming such confusion tend to be very same things that perpetuate or continued or to sustain this confusion that we see, um, and I cannot entirely put the blame in black people as 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 as, as the ones who have consciously regenerated this confusion. This is, I believe, um, this is the facility. This behavior of confusion is the facility or the psychological uh, consequences and results of certain conditioning, certain psychological programming that has to do with uh, the circumstances of apartheid, the circumstances of glorifying whiteness, the circumstances of attaching a status of holiness, the status of cleanliness to whiteness. Uh, another aspect and another source of this confusion is race. It is racial to an extent whereby even in our time we are likely to see that whiteness is a very intimidating um, symbol of power to blackness. Um, although with the language, with the political language that we beginning to listen very carefully being uttered by some political parties and by some movements in society in general, tend to change or tend to attempt to change that tradition. So whiteness itself is a trigger of this confusion, because by its mere existence, it tends to disarm blackness as a result of the status that has been attached in both these racial orientation, which is blackness and whiteness. And the status that has been always, as we are familiar with the fact that whiteness has been made a symbol and a standard of superiority, and anything that does not equate to whiteness, therefore it is not right. Hence I argue that when something in South Africa is not white, then it is not right. right? Whereas blackness, on the other hand, has been, denigrated and demoted into a level of inferiority. And since it does not qualify to be in the same radar, to be in the same, pedestal with whiteness, therefore it tend to be, constantly, suppressed, and that in itself, it becomes a very automatic consciousness whenever a possessor of blackness or a black person is in contact with a white person. When blackness and whiteness are in contact, we tend to, to see, you know um, the dynamics holistically, and certain behaviors that are encompassed within such a dynamic between blackness and whiteness, and the white person and the black person. And one of those behaviors is the fact of, maybe unconsciously, you know, an alarm, an alarming sense from a black person that makes him or her, you know, to be in that state again of chaotic confusion. Um, but this is a narrative that, black people need to overcome, not only on the aspect of race, but also um, politically, um, socially, and otherwise. Because if we are not, investing so much attempt and commitment into, uh, pulverizing or, dismantling that altogether, then we are not going to go forward with the black people. We are not going to achieve, the aspirations of development as a race. We are not going to achieve our ideal of creating that economic structure that is going to make it possible for us, to depend on ourselves.